Hello and welcome to the Joe Ligato Show. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Ligato, and today we're going to be talking about how the capitalists are revolting over China. And this is an article from Unheard, which is an excellent news source. So let's see what they have to say. So after marshaling Europe in its proxy war against Russia, America is now determined to repeat this success against China. Sure, they marshaled Europe, but it led to the deindustrialization of Europe. UK is in a recession, Germany's in a recession. The rest of the Eurozone is likely going to be in a recession if it's not already in a recession. But they did manage to rally all these countries against Russia, although I would say very temporarily because of the fact that these countries are starting to doubt the war against Russia, doubt that it's going to be effective, doubt that it's actually a just war to have. Here, the consequences for Europe could be even more significant than the economic shock of the past year. So yes, there was economic shock, but it didn't really hurt Russia because Russia is not only doing as well as last year, but they're growing compared to last year. And on top of that, they managed to sell more oil to places like Europe compared to last year as well. And I don't understand how or even why Europe would agree to go along with the United States in a conflict with China, because I mean, you can kind of see with the special military operation in Ukraine, maybe you can justify saying that, well, Europe doesn't want to have wars within Europe. But what reason would you have for Europe to pick a fight with China? China does not want to have any type of military conflicts, economic conflicts with other nations. And when you look at the win conditions of China, it really has nothing to do with Europe aside from win-win cooperation and trade with European countries. So you have to conclude at this point that the only reason Europe would enter into a conflict with China is because they're completely controlled by the United States. They don't have any independence anymore. So yet, despite a few grumbles from Macron and others, European leaders are largely playing along with this increasingly aggressive approach. At last week's biannual, this was a few months ago, this article. At last week's biannual US EU Trade and Technology Council, both parties claim to see very much eye to eye on the issue. And again, that can only happen if these countries do not understand what their win conditions are, or if these countries are just completely beholden to what the United States says. So below the surface, however, views are hardening against the EU's efforts to emulate America's hawkish approach, which includes economic decoupling, or de-risking as it's now called, and increasing NATO's presence in the Indo-Pacific. So again, this makes sense. A conflict between the United States and China makes sense as a win condition for the United States. It does not make sense as a win condition for Europe. Europe does not benefit from this in any way, shape, or form. And so the only way they can go along with this is if they're not working in the interests of their own countries. So I consider that to be treasonous, by the way. And I mean, by definition, that is treasonous if you're not doing things for the benefit of the country that elected you and that you're supposed to be representing. So over the past 4 years, von der Leyen has worked tirelessly to keep Europe aligned with America's aggressive geopolitical strategy, often appearing to prioritize Washington's desires over Europe's strategic interests. No wonder Politico dubbed her Europe's American president. So obviously, I mean, someone in the comments section, if you believe that coming into conflict with China is of some benefit to Europe, please explain how. I would love to hear it, because I don't see any way that it could be of a benefit to Europe to be in conflict with China. On China, von der Leyen has taken an increasingly tough line, recently urging Europe to de-risk its relationship. The bloc's foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, has echoed her tone, calling President Xi's support of Russia a blatant violation of its UN commitments. Brussels is also devising a sustainable corporate governance initiative, which would force European countries to ensure that EU social and human rights standards apply throughout their supply chain. Okay, so again, I've talked about this in other videos, but whenever the West wants to come into conflict with other nations, they immediately start screaming about human rights abuses. But when you look at how China had their law enforcement deal with the Hong Kong riots versus how the West deals with their own riots, China is far more humane in terms of dealing with rioters than the West is. And so these human rights concerns are just completely fabrications. They're justifications for hostile actions against China. Germany has already introduced a softer version of the rule, which currently applies only to 150 companies, though the number is set to rise to 15,000 companies. Already, many European companies are pushing back against the measures, claiming that they place an excessive regulatory bureaucratic burden on industry at a time of massive economic challenges. Unsurprisingly, German companies are leading the charge. China is the country's largest trading partner, with total trade last year of nearly 300 billion. Europe's economic powerhouse has already taken heavy toll from its decoupling from Russian gas and other commodities. They made a mistake in that sentence. With its economy in recession and inflation rate, of 7.2%. So Germany, I knew it was in a recession. I didn't know the exact inflation rate. So 7.2%, that's a massive inflation rate. Germany cannot afford to lose China as well. The same can be said for the EU as a whole. So since Germany is the powerhouse, the center of the European Union, particularly with the UK leaving the European Union, they have to work with China if they're working in their own interests. If they're working in America's interests, if they're working in some special interest groups' interests, then sure, they can come into conflict with China. But if they're working in the interests of the actual Europeans that they're supposed to be representing, then they would not be coming into conflict with China. The fact that von der Leyen insists on mimicking the American strategy despite the bloc's deep interdependence with China highlights the extent to which the EU, wedded as it is to a subservient interpretation of the bloc's relationship to the US, is now a threat to Europe's core interests. As Wolfgang Munchau noted, the EU economy is not built for Cold War-style relations because it has become too dependent on global supply chains. So the entire reason after the Cold War that the European Union did so well was because of the fact that they were able to get things like cheap energy, they were able to get cheap, low-tech, low-skill manufacturing goods from China. China has now advanced to high-tech manufacturing goods, and EU has become completely dependent on places like Russia and China, and they don't know what to do at this point. The underlying reality of modern-day Europe is that it cannot easily extricate itself from its relationship with China. In this context, and it obviously can't from Russia either, because it's still buying a ton of oil either directly or indirectly from Russia. In this context, it is hardly surprising that the German businesses are pushing back against Chancellor Olaf Scholz's call to weaken Germany's economic relationship with China. Abandoning China is unthinkable for German industry. Mercedes CEO Ola Kalnias said in April in comments that echoed across the country's boardroom, from Siemens to BASF to BMW, all of which have vowed to continue investing in the country. We won't give up on China, Volkswagen chief financial officer made clear. And obviously, why would they give up on China when China has a huge domestic market and they have a lot of international influence, and they make a lot of goods that go abroad and are extremely beneficial abroad. So not only can you tap into their domestic market to sell your own goods, but you can also purchase goods from them that are of high quality. People are still of the mindset that China is the China of the 1990s, where they made a lot of low quality trinkets, but they're making extremely high complexity manufactured goods at this point. And you need to get with the program if you're still in a early 1990s mindset when it comes to China. They are moving up the value chain, and they are doing it far more successfully than any nation has done before. Yet while similar views are being expressed in Italy and France, China's other two largest trading partners in the EU, it remains unclear whether this will translate into a decisive shift in Europe's official China policy. For now, most national and EU leaders seem more interested in pleasing the US establishment than thinking about Europe's long-term economic and geopolitical interests. However, European business leaders can count on some powerful allies in the US, not in Washington, but among fellow capitalists. So while the United States and other governmental bodies within the West are pushing for war with Russia and pushing for war with China, the capitalists are saying, well, actually, we need the resources from Russia, and we need the resources and manufacturing capacity from China, so we can't actually decouple from them. So there's this pushback from some industry officials. For in America, a similar revolt is brewing over the administration's decoupling with China. Despite the fraying of Sino-American relationships at the political level, several American CEOs have continued to visit China. While the bosses of JP Morgan, Starbucks, GM, and Apple have all flown in since March, it was Elon Musk's visit, which took place last week, that predictably caused the biggest shockwave. So I don't know how much I believe this, though, too, where it's like, on one hand, these big businesses want to have good relations with China, but I think they're also fomenting the American government to push back against China as well, because they need to have access to China without China and the Chinese government having control of them. So these various corporations are talking out of both sides of their mouth right now. They're telling China one thing, but then they're telling the American government to do something else, because we know that the capitalists are completely in charge of the American government. We even have research studies that conclude that as well, that America is oligarchical controlled. According to the Financial Times, in just 2 days, Elon Musk had more top-level Chinese meetings than most Biden administration officials have had in months, including the Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang. So this is of deep concern, because this tells us, well, a few things. One, this tells us that American oligarchs are far more influential than American politicians, because China is willing to negotiate and interact with these oligarchs more than the American politicians. Why would they do that unless these oligarchs are able to influence America to a larger extent than the politicians? But this also tells us that China just doesn't take the American government particularly seriously. I mean, they know that America wants and needs war with China, because the American system is based off of the extraction of resources and exploitation of people all across the world. And so they're just not interested in interacting with the American government. The foreign ministry quoted Musk as saying that he was willing to expand business in China and oppose the decoupling of the United States and China economies, adding that he described the world's two largest economies as conjoined twins. Musk's trip coincided with that by JP Morgan boss Jamie Dimon, who in a speech in Shanghai called for a real engagement between Washington and Beijing. So Musk calling them conjoined twins, I think, is actually kind of archaic, where it used to be that China made things and the United States bought things, but Xi Jinping is very smart, and he's been fostering a domestic market. So actually, China makes things, and then China is also able to buy things with one of the largest domestic markets in the world. I mean, I think you could even say that even though India passed China up in terms of overall population, because of the spending power of the Chinese population, they actually have the largest domestic population if you take into account the actual ability of the population to spend money. And so they're conjoined twins only from the United States perspective. China does not need the United States. The United States, when you look at it, is like the fourth or fifth largest trading partner of China, behind places like the African Union. Oh, I believe it was African Union. I can't remember. But ASEAN, ASEAN, that economic grouping has better trade or more trade with China than the United States. Various other parts of the world also have more trade with China than the United States does. And so there's no reason to actually consider China to be as dependent on the United States as the United States is on China, which is hilarious to a certain extent because of the fact that it's the United States that's antagonistic towards China. But again, I have concluded that they don't really have any other options because of what their economic model is, which is not based off of win-win cooperation like China, but is instead based off of the exploitation of people around the world and extraction of their resources. So such open defiance of Washington's foreign policy stance by some of the most powerful CEOs in America represents a striking development. Critics of the U.S. Western foreign policy and military interventionism have traditionally and correctly seen the latter as being essentially aimed at enforcing the Western-led global capitalistic order. And again, I think that they still are, but they're talking out of both sides of their mouth, as I said earlier. In other words, as being in service of big business by opening up new markets, securing control of resources, or intervening when Western business interests were threatened. As New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman put it in 1999, the hidden hand of the market will never work without a hidden fist. McDonald's cannot flourish without McDonnell Douglas, the builder of the F-15. And the hidden fist that keeps the world safe for American corporations is called the United States Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps. And so you see here, they're saying exactly what we all know, which is that America is controlled by big business, big corporations. So when American service members die, American military people die, it is in the interest of the corporations. They benefit from it across the entire supply chain. However, in light of the growing risk between America's economic political elites, does this analytical framework still hold? It's hard to see, after all, how the West's aggressive US-led foreign policy aimed at antagonizing, militarizing relations with China, the world's second largest consumer market and largest rare earth mineral exporter, in the same fashion as it has with Russia, serves the general interests of Western capital, or even how it serves a strictly capitalistic logic. So they're not able to see exactly what I told you, but I think that I'm right here, which is that they want China, but they don't want the Chinese government, which has been the policy of the United States government for a very long time. They thought that China would just slowly overthrow its government, such as with the Tiananmen Square incident. And for them, they do want the Chinese market, but they do want to antagonize China because they need to antagonize China. They need the American government, the American military to antagonize China in order to overthrow the Chinese government because they don't want the Chinese government oversight. Unlike American oversight, it is actually oversight. If the corporations do something wrong, it is the Communist Party of China that will hold them to account. In America, no one holds the oligarchs to account. And so these oligarchs, they love China. They hate the CPC. How is NATO helping McDonald's, to borrow Friedman's phrase, by forcing it to exit Russia at a cost of more than $1 billion? So I think they wanted Russia to collapse so that they could surround China from more sides. And they also needed Russia to collapse so they could make sure that Russia couldn't influence India, so that India could act as a meat shield, could throw bodies at China to die in a war against China. So really, the United States wants to surround China, and Russia was supposed to help with that. They were supposed to, United States expected that that Russia would slowly decline and would fracture into a ton of smaller nations after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that just did not happen. And so China benefits greatly from a strong Russia that is antagonistic towards the United States, and Russia recognizes that they are definitely a threat to the United States. Not only their relationships with China, but also the fact that they're not willing to allow their resources to be extracted and their people to be exploited, like what was happening in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So no wonder major representatives of Western corporate interests aren't peachy about the prospect of a new Cold War, not to mention an actual war with China, which would have devastating effects on the US and global economy. So here they're thinking that the oligarchs are being completely 100% honest whenever they're going to China. In reality, I think they want two separate things, and they need to go about it in two separate ways. They want to foster relations with China to access the domestic market, but they also want to talk to the American government, dictate to the American government that we want an end to the Chinese Communist Party, or the Communist Party of China, CPC. They want an end to that because they don't want the oversight of an actual government, whereas there's no actual government oversight in the West. However, their appeals today seem to fall on deaf ears in Washington and other Western national capitals. As Adam Tooze has observed, the peace interest anchored in the investment and trading connections of the US big business with China has been expelled from the center stage. On the central axis of US strategy, big business has less influence today than at any time since the end of the Cold War. I don't believe that at all. Big business still has a ton of interest. There was that Stanford study that did show that political change happens based off of what oligarchs want. So that's just not true. I don't think they went through enough effort here to figure out what the objectives were of the CEOs. It was not the exact same thing as what they were telling the Chinese, obviously. Yet this begs the question, if the US Western foreign policy no longer serves the interests of big business, whose interests does it serve? Again, I just don't think they looked at what big business actually wanted here. They took big business at face value, which does not make much sense at all. Well, there is really only one social class that stands to benefit from the militarization of great power relations, the military-industrial complex, Eisenhower's description for the network of corporations and vested interests that revolve around a country's defense and national security sector. What's changed since the 60s, however, is that these interests are no longer aligned with those of the Western corporate community. In fact, two are diametrically opposed. I completely disagree with that statement, as I've mentioned before. The paradox, of course, is that for decades, big business has encouraged the continuous expansion of the military-industrial complex as a tool to promote its interests abroad. Yet, in a Frankenstein-like twist of fate, the beast has been allowed to become so powerful that it has broken free from its masters. It is now turning against them, as Italian author David Colantoni shows in his book on the armed class. No longer is the military-industrial complex subordinated to the general interests of the capitalist class, rather is the latter that is increasingly subordinated to the interests of the military-industrial complex. Again, this is only assuming that the oligarchs are speaking to China in an honest manner, and I don't know why you would ever assume that. If they had other interests that they're trying to work domestically versus abroad, everything that's going on would make complete sense for the capitalist class still being in charge, and there not being an armed class that is distinct from the capitalist class. Now, the US military-industrial complex follows a capitalistic logic as well, of course. War, or even just the constant preparation for war, is clearly good for business. But ultimately, it's about more than just profits. It's about ensuring the reproduction of the military class, which extends well beyond the big defense companies to include civilian auxiliaries and defense-related government agencies, think tanks, academia, and many others. What's slowly becoming clear, however, is that the old capitalist class doesn't seem willing to go down without a fight. Indeed, we may be on the verge of a new historical class struggle, the owners of the means of production against the owners of the means of destruction. That's an interesting catchphrase. I think they're working hand in hand, though. Whoever wins, the peculiar nature of this conflict should not be underestimated. The greatest resistance to a new Cold War isn't coming from a global peace movement, but from the boardrooms of Western corporations. Faced with China's supremacy, they have nothing to lose but their chains. I think that's completely overly optimistic. It does not take into account potential other motivations of the oligarchs in the West. I think it's a pretty silly article, but it is something that I think is worthwhile to go over. It just completely misses the point about what are the win conditions of the military-industrial oligarchs versus the regular capitalistic class oligarchs. And so I think they're completely working in lockstep here. This article just did not do enough to figure out what the underlying motives are of the non-military industrial complex oligarch. Anyways, if you liked this video, please provide us a thumbs up. Please subscribe to our channel for more content. I'm trying to get one long-form video out per day, which is exciting, interesting. It's cool to see that I actually do have enough to talk about on these articles. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please put that in the comment box as well. I love hearing from you. And I think that's it. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.